So, how you
So
been?
I'm surprised. Oh, how have I been? um, Confused, adrift, um, um, all sorts of ups and downs, really.
Okay.
Um, I say that, and that's not really a fair statement. Um, I mean, that's how it kind of looks if looking back. I mean, because this isn't just since the last 2 weeks, but the last 6 weeks or longer. I've told you about it. There have been all kinds
Yeah.
of ups and downs and things happening, and um, uh, there are feelings about them, um, whether it's about the thing itself or about something related to the situation. And so that creates this sense of things kind of being roller coaster like. Uh, but really, that's more of an internal thing than an external thing. I mean, the closest I've had to anything external was Susanna and I had a disagreement, I guess about 4 or 5 nights ago, which was the first time, and I can't even remember how long.
Mm.
And, with us disagreements, worst case scenario, she'll start to get really kind of biting, um, and don't know how to describe it, but she'll just get kind of biting and say certain things. And then, of course, she regrets it and goes back and apologizes. But,
Mm.
uh, and then, I think I said mentioned it in the email about an exchange with Tuesday a couple of mornings ago. Um, Otherwise, with the exception of the fact that Tuesday's just a loud person, it's actually been pretty quiet around here.
Good. That's
uh,
good. But yeah, it is that internal side of things, which is the important one, though.
I agree.
So, like what we had talked about, in the message is always that bringing everything back to putting yourself in the center of it. How is it that I would like this moment to be, and that it's not. How are my expectations of their behavior not living up to what I am expecting? But always keeping it that it's in the perspective of, me in the center, who is
Mhm.
creating these expectations, and the judgments and all of those assumptions. How has that been going since you sent the email?
When you say how has that been going?
Well, have you had triggers of it, or have you had opportunities to investigate that as things have been going on?
Yeah, I have, because hardly a day passes when um, something doesn't happen with Tuesday, whether it's directed towards me or her mom or one of the dogs. Um, it's interesting because any instances that have occurred since that one morning that I mentioned in the email have not been as clear and sharp as that one. Because
Mm,
that morning when there was that exchange, she was really upset with me about something that was very minor,
mm,
and it's something that's never happened before. I'm always really careful about making sure I put these things away in a particular way. And she got really pissy and nasty with me and kind of came after me about it. And when the reaction happened, and then when I started to say something to her, it was all really clear in a way it never had been before. We've been talking about this for quite some time. And you have mentioned this to me from pretty much right at the beginning, going all the way back to the
mm.
group with, um,
Yeah,
I can't
yeah,
remember their names. Gosh,
yeah.
sorry guys if you're watching this. Um, but anyway, having said that, it's funny that it was in that moment where I finally saw it in a really clear, sharp way as it was happening.
Amazing.
You know, I've seen it before, and even in the moment, I mean, to the point of there's an exchange and I stop. I might even turn my back and kind of lean up against a wall or something and just kind of close my eyes and kind of pay attention to that internal sensation. Uh, but it's nothing has ever been as clear and in such sharp relief as it was in that one instance. Don't know why. I wish they were all like that.
I
Uh,
know. Can you say specifically like what it was that you saw or what it was that made that feel like it was more clear and in sharp relief than other times?
there's some of it that I don't think I'll be able to give you what you're looking for here, but the best I can do is to say that I was acutely aware of the fact that this reaction was, I don't know how to say this without it sounding like the reaction is the result of what she said, because you've said it and I do understand it, that that reaction is not because of
Mm.
what she said, because that
Yeah.
reaction is particular to this particular entity.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was very clear that that reaction was happening in the context of her and I, and the fact that we have these sorts of things come up, and she was saying things and acting in a way that gave rise to that reaction. Um, and I'm still not describing it very well. It's that it was very particular. It was kind of like a chemical reaction. It's very
Mm.
particular to um, two things being in contact.
Yeah.
Um, and if it had been, like, say for instance, if there had been another person and Tuesday had acted that way, they probably would have, shrugged and, wow, yeah, that kid needs to lighten up and walked
Yeah.
off.
Yeah.
Uh, so it was particular or maybe even peculiar to our particular chemistry. And I, I could feel it um, very, hmm, I could feel it very distinctly. Um, Sometimes in fact, usually the physical sensation is not that distinct. And I was aware, very aware of the fact that this sort of thing in the past has caused problems,
Mm.
and that if nothing else, I needed to make sure that it didn't create problems. And the inclination to act on it still happened and was followed, but fortunately not, things didn't turn out the way they have in the past.
Mm.
And and after having said something to her, realizing that not only is that not helpful in any way, it really isn't. It's not necessary. It really isn't necessary. It doesn't accomplish anything. It's not protecting or defending anyone. Um, the idea that somehow it is doing something beneficial is, completely erroneous belief. There's no truth to that. Even if I say things in a way, which that morning I was pretty calm about it. Still, just the fact that I'm responding to her is going to irritate the crap out of her at the very least, if not just piss her off.
Yeah.
Because she's
Yeah.
pretty reactive, and when she's in that state, she's very reactive.
Mm.
So that there was that awareness of the fact that this doesn't this is something that's better avoided. And um, and then finally, the only other thing I can say about it in terms of what was clear was that this needed to be looked into and need to really see and understand what's going on with those reactions, and um, taking them apart so that they can be so there's taking that apart so that there's a clear understanding of how and why um, that really doesn't need to happen.
Mm.
Because
Well,
when we look into these things, often it's the case that we get a new understanding, we see them from a different angle, and it's very easy for there to be an understanding that leads to other intentions or responses rather than whatever we've typically done in those situations.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Did you feel like eh, it's always such a hard thing to try to pin down? Um, was the clarity that was there something like when you had that sort of recognition in that clear way? Did that feel like something which yeah, it's so hard to because I basically what I want to ask is did it seem like the kind of thing which clearly shifts your perspective so that the next time you're in one of those situations, or if you've been in, similar situations since, that same kind of immediate recognition kicks on. And because you had said that
Hmm.
it hasn't, that one for whatever reason was particularly, um, clear and stark. Um, I don't know. It's the kind of thing where once we have that, when you really feel that it's almost like that sort of internal alignment or that kind of empty uh, the emptiness of the reactivity is just so starkly obvious that that has kind of a momentum that carries on in other instances. And it's kind of what I'm trying to ask is has that kind of been your experience from that, or was it just one very clear instance of seeing what we've been talking about, but then it kind of just was a one-time thing and hasn't.
It's had it's had it's had the kind of effect you're describing, but not quite in the way that you're talking about. Instead of having that sort of clarity in the moment when these things have happened since then, what has actually happened is um, the inclination or intention to react has been um, kept in check. Like last night, I asked her to take care of something before she went to bed, and she was really pissy about it. And I felt the reaction. I felt that thing that happens in the body
Mm,
in those situations. And I wanted to ask her something about it. I wanted to say something about it, but it wasn't going to happen.
mm,
The overriding intention was to just leave it alone and walk away from it. And that's been more often than not the case since then. Is that because that was that was the central idea out of all of that, rather than it becoming a situation where something happens, there's a reaction, and there's that very clear awareness about it. Instead, it seems to, and I didn't even really think about this until you asked. I hadn't really noticed it, but this is the case: is that now what seems to have resulted from that is um, to not say anything,
mm,
to stay out of it. Which, that's good, but at the same time, there's one thing that's lacking in that, and that is that I still need to see what's going on in there because the question has come up many times in the last few weeks. What is it about her her behavior
mhm,
that sets off certain things here? And I know that a lot of it has to do with my mom, and even moreover, and this was surprising when I first realized this because it always seems to be mom, but in this
mm.
case, it actually is more my younger sister,
Okay.
um, who anyone who has known my sister will confirm this. She can be incredibly sharp, cutting, just just biting and acidic and can really be incredibly uncomfortable to deal with. And so over the years, she said a number of things that really left a mark.
Mm.
What she said and how she said it and what have you. So I understand that. I understand that when it comes to these interactions with Tuesday, a lot of it refers back to my younger sister, but that still doesn't answer the question. I've been trying to answer the question. Okay, so if that's the case, then what?
Yeah.
Or if we set aside the issue of my sister, who Tuesday she reminds Susanna of my younger sister as
Mm.
well. We both still talk about it. It's really remarkable to us how much she reminds us of my younger sister, not just in the way she acts, but also even the way she looks. Physically, there's a lot
Yeah.
of similarity. Um, so, that's all fine and well, but what else is going on there? If we, like I said, if we set aside the issue of my sister, and the resemblance and what have you,
Mm.
well, what else? And I haven't been able to figure that out. I've put a little time into it. I mean, not as much as I think it really needs, but I have put some time into it. And, right now it's still kind of a mystery. What else is there? Because you know how when you come to understand something, there's kind of that aha moment, and
Yeah,
you
yeah,
feel it in the body.
yeah,
That's the thing that hasn't happened yet. I haven't had that, with the exception of when I realized, oh, she reminds me of Krista, and this is
yeah.
kind of coming from her. But this, I can
But
still tell. There's a feeling. There's something else there that has not been
yeah.
uncovered.
But let me kind of devil's advocate for a second. So even when you have the recognition that you feel like you're being triggered in some way because there's a memory of your sister and how she would treat you, or even your mother and how you were treated, has that recognition actually caused any change in your reactivity or the amount that you're triggered?
Hmm.
We can cognitively say, oh, okay, well, it makes sense that I'm being triggered because it reminds me of this situation. But does that actually have any effect on whether or not you're being triggered?
I don't think it does.
Most likely not. Just because it's like, just because you know that touching a fuse to a match is, why it's lit, it doesn't stop the fuse from being lit when it comes in contact with a flame. Like
Right.
you still the chemical reaction is still possible. You just understand why it works the way that it does.
You're
Why
right.
it is, right? But even at that, we still don't even really know that that's why it is. It's like a psychologically or intellectually persuasive uh, piece of evidence. We don't know that it's really true. We don't know that the reason why you're getting triggered by her is because of something that your sister said or did in the past, or even that she really is, it's because Tuesday reminds you of her.
Right.
It's just we like having these neat, we find patterns everywhere. And so we
Right.
like when we feel like we've solved the puzzle. And I've figured it out. That's what it is. She reminds me of her. She did something bad to me. So when I'm being triggered by her, when, you know, intellectually it seems to tie it up in a bow and it feels satisfying in that way. But it doesn't
Right.
really change the whole premise. It doesn't change what's actually happening. It
No,
doesn't,
you're right.
it's not like, you know, it's not like that gives you a sense of closure and um, healing with your sister or with Tuesday. It just kind of draws this false equivalency between them. It makes it so, yeah, my sister was a perpetrator in some way. I was the victim. Now I'm in another situation where Tuesday is acting like my sister, which then puts me in that same sort of relationship of victim to perpetrator that I was in. Or this similar behavior reminds me of being in this situation, so I feel reactive because now I'm a 6 year old again being reactive against my older sister. We can do all of this mental juggling where we say it's probably because of this, but it doesn't actually affect the way that you behave in that current situation or the way that you
Right.
feel in the current situation. So I think perhaps more direct way of going about it is to go towards the vulnerability or to heal the vulnerability that you have to criticism in general, to the behavior of others in general.
Hmm.
Because it's that vulnerability, right? Your sister at some point said something that was biting and cruel, and it left a lasting mark because it was believed.
Right.
Now, whether you already harbored that belief and she just poked the wound and made it that much worse, or whether it was a new belief in yourself that you then uh, took on because it was coming from her, either one of those, the problem is it was believed. When other people say something to us, it has absolutely nothing to do with us. There is absolutely no connection between me saying something about you, or Tuesday saying something about you, or you saying something about Tuesday. There is no actual connection between those entities as far as those words go, right? The words do not actually make the wound. They don't actually pour salt on the wound or poke the wound. They're not actually doing anything that you are not basically allowing them to do, right? You're kind of, it's like, you know, when you're mean to somebody and you say something, it's like you put a knife on the table, but or, like if I'm being saying that you're an inconsiderate jerk, I put a knife on the table. You have to pick up that knife and stab it into yourself to cause the wound,
Right.
right? It's I can't do that just by saying that. You have to believe that you are an inconsiderate jerk. You have to take that on for that to cause the injury in you. And then you have to keep remembering that and reinforcing that as time goes on. So that vulnerability that we have is to really take personally when somebody says something about us. When Tuesday is, aggravated about something and takes it out on you, or when you don't do things that the way that she feels is the right way or whatever it is, and she says something that you say is biting, it's just a word, right? You
Right.
literally have to take that knife and do something with it to cause that injury in yourself. It doesn't literally bite you. You have to believe it. There has to be something there that makes those words into something. They're just completely, benign, meaningless sound waves riding through the air.
Right.
There has to be something on the inside that makes them into something that actually bites. So it's coming to that vulnerability in us. Why is it that I am prone to taking things that other people say and making them so that they really feel like they are about me and they really hurt when they do?
Well, the question I was going to ask was about how to do something about this, and and I automatically what came to mind was the affirmations and the reparenting, which I still do, not as frequent as I used to. Which the more that we take those opportunities, the more we're working towards freeing ourselves from that vulnerability. But is there anything else that someone can do in this situation to to dissolve that vulnerability?
Recognize the emptiness of the words. Recognize the absolute powerlessness of anything that anybody says about you, the unreality of it.
Okay.
We have to create the meaning out of whatever it is that we hear. And obviously, it's happening because of our conditioning. It's happening very quickly. But
Right.
we have that kind of conscious element that we can bring to these things, just like you had in the clarity of that moment when you realized that you didn't have to actually respond and react in a certain way.
Right.
There is that clarity that we can have that a word is literally just empty sound until we put that level, that layer of meaning onto it, and then turn it around and say that it means something about me. It's still always pointing back to some fundamental character in here who is the one who is being judged or insulted or discriminated against or something that makes me feel like I am the victim in the situation. They are being mean. They are saying something that is biting and cruel and sharp and all of those words that we use that sound like we're being violently physically injured, recognizing that the words themselves don't do that. We have to play an equal part in that process.
Right.
So it's really looking at it that one, the words aren't doing the job. The meaning that we put on them and the identification that we bake into it is what's doing the job. But also, two, we can see that the person who is out there who is insulting me or being, mean and aggressive or whatever, they are reacting out of their own bubble. They're not seeing whatever this is in its totality. They are reflecting their insecurities and their uncomfortableness in this moment and their lack of emotional maturity and ability to handle the feelings that are going on in their body. And so they lash out from that. We're just seeing people reacting out of the discomfort, basically. We can look around at people and recognize everybody is reacting out of that same discomfort. And then we can, for one, not take it personally, but two, we can actually have compassion for them because we realize that it's only coming about because they don't have the tools to be able to just be with whatever is going on in this moment. They don't have the tools to health in a healthy way manage the emotions that they're feeling. And they're being swept away by them and they're being reactive and they're hurting other people because they don't know any other way to be. And so we don't have to take it personally. And instead, we can be, in the line of that verbal fire, essentially. And we're no longer in the line of that verbal fire. We recognize that those words don't leave their bubble. We can't be injured by those words, right? They're coming out of their bubble about somebody that doesn't really exist. Those words are not they don't have to cross that gap to get into our bubble where they start to, react with our conditioning and make something more out of it than is really there.
Hmm.
It's like the way that I see it is really like that person is over there on the other side of the room and they're ranting and raving and they're, slinging insults and all of this stuff is going on. And they are in their own little universe bubble echo chamber. It's just happening there. They have their own view of the world and of what's going on in it and their own sort of avatar of me in that room with them. But they're not even reacting to the real whatever this is. They're reacting to the avatar of what this is. It's their own representation in their mind of what this is. And those words that they're saying over there just stay over there. I can hear them, obviously. It's not like, there's sound is getting here and I can understand what they're saying. But the meaning, that meaning which would have to hit something here, that would have to be made into something personal, doesn't cross that gap between our bubbles. I'm in this bubble, they're in that bubble. The sound may travel between them, but that extra layer of meaning and the injurious nature of those words has to be created in here. You know, the knife isn't leaving their bubble. It's not
Right.
us. I'm not picking that up. You know, I'm not creating it. I'm not making anything out of it. And so then you can just sit there. I can sit there and have compassion for them that they are clearly in so much pain right now that that's the only way that they know how to react. And it's that viewpoint where we can really come above, you know, it's no longer about me. It's not about them getting angry at me and me really feeling the wounds of history and that, you know, they're saying something that really speaks to some deep inner truth in me that, you know, they know this is my weak spot and they know what buttons to push and they know, you know, where to push that wound and really hurt me. I know where to really hurt me. I know where my vulnerabilities are. I'm taking whatever they're laying out and I'm poking those wounds because I know what stings. I'm taking the bait. We don't have to do that.
You know, it's interesting because something that I realized a long time ago that is also a factor in this is the fact that when someone does something like that, there's the intention to hurt.
Mm.
You know, they want to do something to, I don't know how else to say it, and because it seems like it could be overstating it, but they want to do something to hurt me or whoever they're directing it at. But what you're just saying is also included in that because that sense of wanting to strike out and do something to affect another person, it also doesn't cross that gap.
Nope.
That's in fact, they're probably like in Tuesday's case, I'm sure she is not aware of it, not in any real conscious
Mhm.
way. Um, and so that only takes on life over here with the awareness of, oh, they're doing that to try to hurt. So,
Yep.
boy, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm kind of letting that sink in.
Yeah. Please do.
Um, I mean, you've said that to me before, and gradually over time, I've understood it more. At first, I could not break out of that um, ingrained sense of cause and effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or, you know, I know it's a minor distinction, but it seems like a big one to me if I say it's causality.
Hmm.
But now it's gradually started to get clearer, and here today, it really has become very clear in a way that it hadn't been before. I mean, I don't expect that the next time somebody says something to me like that, that there won't be a reaction, but there's going to be something there that can be a lens to see it through so that it
Exactly.
doesn't have to have the potency that it's always had.
Exactly. Yeah, we're planting seeds, you know, and those seeds eventually grow into new conditions and of new conditioning of their own. And so we're changing the likelihood that things will always play out the way that they have, you know, or hopefully putting in some new possibilities into the system.
Right?
But it's really that you know, in a lot of the old Zen stories where it's like, you know, the person is untouchable, the sage is untouchable by,
Yeah,
you know, hot ice and fire and all of that, you know, the person can say anything to them and it doesn't, that's what we're talking about. It's really recognizing that it does not touch anything in here.
right. And the thing is that you know, I've known people and had conversations with other people about that, and I've run into more than a few people who really balk at that idea of arriving at a more or less sort of Teflon kind of place.
Mm.
But the thing is, and I've told you about it before, so I won't go into length into any detail about this, but I I've mentioned before two people I knew in AA who were that way.
Yeah.
And then as you were saying that, when you said Zen, it brought to mind the, I forget what his title was, but I used to go to this Zen center and the guy who ran it, when they I'm sure you're familiar with in Zen that they can become a monastic without actually leaving
Yeah.
a householder life. And
Yeah.
so he had done that, and he'd been a Zen monk for like 30 years or something. And there was this famous story that was told in the group because somebody had seen him. He was a manager at a bookstore,
Oh,
and
wow.
somebody had been in the bookstore and they had seen him getting royally chewed out by this woman.
Mm.
And the story was they didn't know he was there, or he didn't know that person from the group was there, and
Okay.
they were watching it at a distance. And they said that as this woman just eviscerated him and was just horrible, um, not even his face didn't even change. There was no reaction. He just stood there very
Yeah.
calmly and listened until he finally could begin to speak. And if when it went on again, no reaction. He was just,
Yeah.
totally, a, the surface of the lake was undisturbed completely,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
That's amazing.
So,
Exactly.
so I know that this is not something that is some sort of unattainable
Mm-mm.
place to arrive at, you know.
No, it's really like a matter of insight. When you really, really just see that that person is not directing anything at me. Like there's nothing here for it to hit. I mean, we can have these kind of different visual metaphors that one might resonate for one person, not for the other. So we can look at it like I said, we're in our individual little bubbles and it just doesn't cross the gap. We can also see that there is literally nothing in here from the no self standpoint.
Mhm.
They can fire all the arrows they want, metaphorically, and they're going right through. There is nothing for them to land. We need a self to have that stick to.
Right.
Right? The identification that we need to hold on to be injured by somebody's words is the sort of identification that we are investigating, that we're looking into, that we're trying to see through. And when you don't feel that identification is operative anymore, it's actually here to be wounded, then they can fire all the arrows they want and they just go straight through because there's nothing for them to stick to.
Well, I'm glad you said that because that raises something. It raises a question that has come to mind from time to time in recent weeks. Yeah, I can certain contexts really bring out the lack of identity or feeling like someone. Like for instance, walking down that hallway, whether it's leaving or coming back, frequently the mind goes to and notices that it doesn't feel like anyone going anywhere. And
Yeah.
that's noticeable because it used to be that, and usually I think the reason is because of the fact that usually, especially if I'm heading that way, it's because I've been called. Somebody needs something, something's happening. And
Yeah.
so, you can easily understand how that would create a sense of somebody. And so
Yeah.
there's this sense of somebody going somewhere to do something. And now it's not there. It's just
Wonder.
there's this, there's going down the hall. There's not
Yeah.
anyone going to do anything. There's just going down the hall.
Yeah.
Um, and there are other contexts where that kind of thing is really clear, and they happen pretty frequently, where it's really easy to see and feel the lack of a sense of somebody, and that has become something of a belief. And I want to be careful about this because when I say belief,
Mhm.
people can believe anything, and a belief is frequently dangerous because frequently these beliefs are um, they're mistaken or untrue. Uh,
Yeah.
but in this case, it's a belief in the sense of this has been seen and felt so many times that it's become really difficult to take seriously the idea of someone.
Mm.
A case in point was earlier this morning. I was doing something and muttering out loud to myself and said something about I need to do X. And at that moment, it was really clear that there was nobody doing anything. It was just
Yeah.
things happening. And I
Yeah.
kind of chuckled and I went, I need to do something. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But other times, like Tuesday says something, or I'll walk into the room and Susanna's listening to something political, which I avoid like the
Yeah.
plague.
Usually a good
And
idea.
yeah, and there's a reaction, and maybe it doesn't exist in the same really hardened, concretized sort of way that it did before, but still that reaction that kind of pulls together someone in that moment, and maybe even for a while. If that's really upsetting for the rest of the afternoon, there's some degree of feeling like someone. And
Hmm.
so it's really interesting to notice how sometimes there's this absence of it. And then other times, in spite of the absence, in so many different cases, the opposite is true.
Yeah.
And that has really been kind of puzzling. And the only answer I've been able to come up with, not that it's necessarily important to have one, is, oh, so this is conditioning.
Yeah.
But I don't
Yeah.
feel like that's the whole story, though.
No, but I don't think we can ever come to the whole story because we don't really
Hmm,
know how any of this actually works. I mean, I'm
good
inclined to
point.
say, from the neurological perspective, that some of it is just we have certain habits of the brain where certain networks are functional more than others. And as we do this kind of practice, we're changing which networks are on more of the time than others. But
Hmm,
depending on even which neuroscientist you listen talk, um, they all have different variations of kind of where the self is located and which networks exactly are always the ones responsible and depending on the type of situation where it engages certain things like fear or self-talk or things like that, it's actually engaging those selfing networks more than others. But I think I'm hesitant to put the entire stock of belief into that because we just don't know enough yet. We don't know how much of it is based on the conditioning of this whole mind body organism, how much of it is coming down to states of the brain, how much of it is something else we just aren't even aware of at this point. So I would say rather than getting caught in the trying to find the exact mechanism of why you're sometimes selfing, sometimes not, it's just important to notice when you are selfing, right? You've heard the news, you feel like a self now is engaged in some way. Well, what is actually different in the experience now than what it was before when you weren't selfing? Notice, is it feeling like there is a self here now because there's a feeling of concern in the body? Is there like a personal concern? Is it, how the fate of the country is going to um, play out for me, how this is going to affect me? Is it that I'm feeling a sense of, righteous indignation and that gives me a sense of being a self again? Am I feeling, sorry for people who are being victimized? And am I in some way relating myself to those who are in the position of being the victim? We can kind of find like what really feels personal about this particular moment. Scan through the body. Are you actually holding tension in places that you weren't a moment before? Are you having thoughts which are more, should, shouldn't, right and wrong, clear cut, dualistic thoughts, those bastards over there shouldn't, blah, blah, blah. That tends to reinforce my position and my belief system being right. And there's identification built into that. So the more we do things that feel like they're polarizing the sense of me versus them, us versus them, all of that is helping to create and substantiate that feeling of identification. If there's a fear element involved, that can be very potent in reinforcing the sense of identification that's here.
Right.
Um, if it's something where, again, like you're in an argument with somebody or somebody is, getting testy with you or something, again, it can trigger those sensations in the body that you might notice. There's some sort of like a fear response or a protective response, or it's triggering those thoughts which say, yes, that's right, I am the bad guy, or something to that effect. And then those thoughts themselves are reinforcing that feeling of selfing. So it's just noticing as soon as you recognize that, is there really a self here? Or is this a pattern of behavior or a pattern of sensations in the body or a pattern of thoughts which give the illusion of that self having come back online? There wasn't a self there to begin with. It hasn't materialized by the belief that my political party is or my political view is correct and theirs is wrong, or that I'm really being attacked by this person or any of that. That doesn't create the self. It helps create the illusion of the self. So we just want to be
Oh,
clear on what the illusion of the self is made of.
that's a really important distinction. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's one of those things that when you say it, it's really obvious, but
yeah.
it was getting overlooked until you had said that. So hold on, let me get clear on that. It's not creating the
A
self; it's
self,
creating the
creating the
illusion of the
illusion
self.
of a self.
Okay, that's really important.
I think we kind of overlook that fact in kind of the whole non-dual spiritual pursuit a lot.
Oh,
We really we use terms a lot like, killing the ego or, ego death or, breaking the first fetter, which sounds like you're actually like, destroying the self and having it dissolve and never come back again. And that's not what we're talking about. It's just recognizing that it's always been an illusion. It was never
yes,
to begin with. And so people get into these real, ironically, selfing spirals of like, oh my God, but there wasn't a self, and now it feels like there's a self again. I must have done something wrong. Where I've lost it and all of that. And it's just that the illusion is back online. Like the illusion is being created again. Okay, so
and
see how it's being created. It's not real.
the illusion's being created, but also I'm going to extrapolate from my own experience to others
Yeah.
that in that moment, there is this unspoken, unconscious, but very strongly sensed and active belief in the
Hmm.
illusion.
Yeah, absolutely right. Spot on.
Okay.
And it's recognizing that I think in the kind of, practice that we do, it's about recognizing the illusion, the parts that are making up that illusion so that we can see when it shows up. We recognize what it actually feels like to be a self as we commonly think of it.
Hmm.
We call that the illusion. What components, right? What are you feeling in the body? What are you thinking in the mind? What are you hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting? All of that. Which parts of that is helping to create that sense of the illusion? But then you're right on that the problem is that we believe that that illusion is something real and substantial, and we buy into all of the thoughts that come up about it. All of those beliefs about me and how I am and how others see me and how I need to be and how I should be better and improved upon and you know every deeply held belief about me and my abilities and my limitations, all of that is buying in to the illusion. It's a thought believing in another thought about an illusion. It's just levels of abstraction pointing to nothing at all. But we have to see through each of those. We have to recognize that this isn't the illusion of the self isn't a real thing, and that even the belief in that is just another thought, which is claiming ownership or responsibility for something, have agency. Well, that's a thought.
That is so mind-boggling to think about it now. Why would one thought have more um, more veracity, more authority um, than another thought. I mean, that doesn't make
Exactly.
sense. That's completely weird.
I know, but it's the way that we operate because we just
Yeah.
aren't aware of the illogic of our basic framework of perception. It's how we go about making meaning out of everything that we experience. And we don't really look deeply enough to see that this is a thought commenting on another thought, and that neither of those thoughts have any more, as you said, veracity or substance or connection to some bigger reality than it's any other thought. This thought right now does not know more than the thought that came 10 seconds ago.
Huh.
Right? It's no more omniscient than any other thought that has been had by this mind.
That is mind-boggling. I'm going to be thinking about that for days. That one thought somehow has more authority or believability or truth to it, is more right than another one. I mean, that's wow.
And we could kind of play with this and tear it apart by saying like, okay, right now in my room, the thought that there is a plant right there is technically more accurate than the thought that there is a green giraffe sitting on my lap, right? Like
Right.
clearly one has a little bit more connection to the reality of the space than the other. But in terms of like the beliefs that we have about ourselves, about the reality of myself, the things that I think about myself, and all of that, those those are thoughts that have no. They're basically all pointing to the green giraffe that's not here, right? Like when we're talking about things which are kind of clearly in our physical reality, we can talk about that on a level where there is a level of truth to it to be had. You know, it's not the only truth. We could break it down and say that there is no actual plant there. It's just, a bunch of atoms and that sort of thing. We could also say, I don't really know that there's a plant there because my experience of the plant is sort of green color that's being separated from the brown color that's adjacent to it. I don't know if I'm visually hallucinating a plant. I can't really tell you that there's an actual plant and that it's not just a product of the mind. I definitely am not seeing the plant the way that the plant really is, as it in whatever context that is. I can feel a leaf of the plant, but that feeling, that like sensation of touching the leaf does not actually match up the way that we just intrinsically think it does with the colored image that we're taking to be the plant. The elements have to be bound in a way by the mind into something which we take to be a plant. So individually, each one of those thoughts doesn't really point to something conclusively, distinctively real either. But just for the sake of, keeping it in kind of first fetterland as far as dealing with the belief in the self and all of the aspects of the self and all of that, we really want to be clear on the fact that a thought is just a thought. The thought
Right.
itself does not know that that plant has any reality to it. I would need some other third party to come in and do, scientific tests on the plant and determine that it's actually a living plant and not an alien that is here, shape shifting and giving the illusion of a plant, or that I'm not in a coma right now and hallucinating the entire thing, or having some sort of a sort of a psychotic episode where I'm imagining a plant. Like all sorts of things could happen, but we can't tell just by the raw experience of that thought that there is anything true beyond the nature of that thought. We can't tell that that thought actually points to anything outside of itself.
Hmm.
We
Wow.
kind of,
That's okay.
we
Sorry,
kind of,
that was just I was just letting that sink in.
yeah, sure, sure, sure.
Hold on a minute. So
Yeah.
the thought doesn't point to anything.
Outside of itself. We can't prove that any thought points to anything outside of the content of its own thought, its own content. We take it on faith that for the most part, thoughts that we have about the world have enough connection to some sort of external reality that we are not completely debilitated and walking around in dangerously diverse hallucinations that diverge from what's really here. But when we're really analyzing this stuff, we get into that spooky territory of recognizing that by virtue of any individual thought, it cannot know that the contents of itself are true or real in any way. It is just a mental representation of something.
Right.
Whether it's accurate or not, we can't say by virtue of that mental representation itself. And when that mental representation is about the self, the me, well, now we're having mental representations about a fictional character. We're really having discussions about Charlie Brown and, you know, how deeply flawed of a person he is and how he really needs to get his shit together. And like we're really feeling, so much like personal pain for his struggle, but he doesn't actually exist in that way. And it's the same for all of this. It's a thought about something that doesn't have that level of existence. So it's so important to note that a thought is only a passing mental representation of something. And it in itself is completely conditioned by the nature of this biological organism and everything that it has encountered throughout the number of years that this biological organism has been alive. The thought, again, some of them are more like accurate to the external environment than others, but from within the experience of the thought, we have absolutely no way to tell that we are not completely hallucinating that thought out of thin air. We don't
Right.
know that that has any veracity. It's very much like AI now, where
Hmm.
as good and accurate as it can be in a lot of ways, if it doesn't know something, it hallucinates a new fact to put up. And it still does it. It was really bad at that like a year ago. And it would just completely lie to you over and over again. And it would change the facts every time and just say, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, you're right. That person didn't actually write this book. The actual correct name of the book is blah, blah, blah. And it would just hallucinate a new truth. And every time you pushed back on it, it would hallucinate a new truth and say, I'm so sorry, you're right. Or it would just say, no, you're mistaken. It really is this way. And it would just brazenly lie and create a new truth. But from right now, obviously we're kind of anthropomorphizing AI, but from within
Mhm.
the context of that AI thought, it doesn't really know whether that is true or not. And that is very synonymous to how it is for us, that in the context of that one individual thought, not relating it to all these other thoughts that might come up around it, before it, or after it, but in that one particular thought, there is no way to tell whether that thought has any relationship to quote unquote external reality.
Right.
So,
And it, I can understand why it's a hard spell to break. I mean, some of this stuff is a little easier for me to get to because of things I've been interested in and things I've done over the last 35 years. But considering that we're all coming from um, more or less some very hard materialism, and the assumption was that all of this is real and
yeah,
solid,
yeah,
and and that's a shared idea. That's kind of the foundation of consensus reality.
Yeah.
But now what we're finding out is that actually it's not. It's what you're describing, where it's sort of like putting on
VR
goggles
headset.
for a video game, yeah, for
Yeah.
VR, and in this environment. And what we're living in is, you're hearing these people like Donald Hoffman and others saying, that it's closer to the Matrix. This
Yeah.
is more on the more in the line along the lines of a hologram.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
so.
It's fascinating, but it can be really destabilizing for people too, because
Mhm.
it does bring into question any moment. I mean, since Pernilla and I have been together, we've often joked about, which one of us is basically in the coma, hallucinating all of this. Probably one of us, but we're not sure who it is. We'll be like, so is this your coma or is this my
That's
coma?
great.
Yeah, and we have no way to tell. We literally would not know whether this was real or a coma hallucination or a psychotic break or, we often play with that. And it's like, I wouldn't know that I'm not in a hospital right now, completely comatose, just imagining all of this.
Right. Well, and when you consider things like, um, I had an experience, gosh, it's been, I guess, what, 25, 30 years ago, where I wound up ingesting, smoking
Mm.
what is probably an overdose of salvia.
Okay. Oh God.
And the minute my head hit the pillow, I was gone. And I woke up, my head went down and I was gone, and then came to on a cold table in a laboratory. And there are all these people in white coats working around me. And
Wow.
I'm listening to them talk. And they're saying, if we don't get him back, we're never going to get him back. He'll be lost there forever. We will not be able to bring him back here.
Wow.
And I don't really remember the rest of it because I was so, I mean, there aren't even words for it because it
Yeah.
was every bit as real as this. Every bit. I mean, there's not any little something, any little detail
Yeah.
that somehow made it possible for me to go, no, it wasn't quite as real as this. No, it was every bit as real and believable and solid as here, whatever here
Incredible.
is. And that has stayed with me ever since. I've never forgotten that. And
Yeah.
that tends to inform my experience
I
because of
get
the
that.
fact that, I mean, I walked around for weeks after that, not really sure, kind of like what you're saying about with you and
Yeah.
Pernilla. Some time, I was not really sure that this was some sort of hologram or VR that I'd been
Yep.
projected into.
Exactly.
I had no way of knowing.
It's so fascinating. I'm really intrigued. I've never tried salvia. I'm not particularly, uh, yeah, I don't think I'm going to try salvia at any point. But reading the stories that I've heard about people who've had, it's just so fascinating. Um,
Yeah, it is.
and yeah, yeah, and the way that it bends time for people, and if we can live a life of 1,000 or a couple thousand years in that 10-15 minute salvia trip, and
Hmm.
it really draws all of this into a finer view. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you do also hear where it really lingers with people for decades because it can feel that real. That like there was the one, I can't remember if I mentioned it to you at some point. The story where somebody had they smoked it and then immediately woke up in a different life with where like 30 years later, the person who used it, they were like 19, and they woke up like 30 years later with a wife and kids working a job, and they lived for like 30 years in this life, like living with the family and everything and at first like knew like wait a minute, I'm only 19, I'm not supposed to be here. Like they knew in the dream that it or in the hallucination that it wasn't real, they weren't supposed to be there, but they just started living that life, and for 30 years they lived this life out, and then went up into the attic and found a box, and in the box was the pipe that they had smoked the first hit salvi hit out of, and took a hit in the attic of the salvia and then woke up in their 19-year-old body and like was like for years like mourning the loss of that family that they just lived with for 30 years as their kids and wife and all of this, and that felt just as real or more real than their actual 19 years that they have lived on the planet.
Holy
And
cow.
yeah, and so that is just staggering to live an entire 30-year stretch in 15 minutes, but to feel that it's so real that you now mourn the loss of that family that you had, and it really screwed them up.
Yeah, I can see how.
So
Well, and Susanna had it didn't involve that kind of thing where you were projected into another completely real world. In fact, I wish I could remember what the experience was, but the important point is that Susanna had an experience that completely, I mean, she said that her ego was completely, it was gone. There was no
mm,
sense of being anyone. And of course, at that point in time, we really hadn't come to this sort of thing. And it
mm,
happened very suddenly. So it wasn't something that um, was freeing or liberating. It was incredibly uncomfortable and like you said, destabilizing. And it took her probably about 3 months to get to a point where she could really function again and had kind of pulled herself back together.
yeah,
You
wow,
know? So, I
wow.
mean, on one hand, there is some use or benefit, but on the other hand, it's one of those things that, here there be dragons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I I feel like it's, for some people it's like the wake up call to the fact that there are other ways to perceive the world, but
Hmm.
it is so fraught with danger that because you just don't know what the experience is going to be, that
Yep.
there are much gentler ways of getting there. And also, you see people who use a lot of psychedelics, and nowadays especially like DMT pens are like a big thing now that you see.
I had no idea.
Yeah, like
Huh.
DMT vapes. So people are
Yeah.
like, I've seen like so many Insta videos and stuff of people just like casually talking about these DMT vapes that they're using and like using them a lot. And it really can become a thing where, you recognize like these people are not having, amazing, like they're not becoming Buddhas by doing it. They're just
Right.
using it as like another, fun psychedelic drug trip. Like it's just any other drug. And
Right.
for some, it can be really, cause like psychosis. And for others, it's just, fun, 15-minute high or trip or something that's happening, depending on the dosage that they're using. But it's like, um, I think it's really important to keep in mind with any of the psychedelics that they don't cause real deep lasting insight in a way, especially when you're just using them sort of casually, and
Right.
not in a very rigid, specific environment that's made to have some sort of a like a transformational insight kind of effect. But ultimately, the real lasting effects that we find are the ones that you get by actually inquiring into your sober daily reality,
Yeah.
because that's where you actually find the illusions. That's where you find that you can actually break apart all of those supposedly real parts of our mundane life. And that is where real change happens.
Well, I used all of the classic psychedelics, some more than others, regularly and at very high doses for a number of years, going back into an earlier point in my life. And while it was beneficial and it did bring some positive, lasting changes, it didn't do anything with regards to the process and path that we're talking about. And the first question that comes to mind is if if we could get that from that sort of experience, like I'll use myself. If I had
Mhm.
gotten that experience or gotten that insight and understanding from those experiences, what would happen and how would I be affected? And what would it do to my behavior if that had happened, but I hadn't done anything about all of the things that the affirmations and reparenting have
Mm,
been addressing
yeah.
and slowly changing. You know, all of that stuff, all of that central belief about being the problem in, you know, whether it's my family or, you know, wherever it shows up in my life, and all of the other things that are attached to that, and that's sort of the foundation, all of those beliefs about, you know, that view of the self, you know, that would still be intact,
Yeah.
and it would still be informing my actions, my
Yep.
behavior. And, you know, so it's hard to think about something that could undo the sense of self, and what would my life look like if that's undone, but there's still that belief and all the beliefs that go along with it present in my life. It
Yeah.
seems that at the very least, there would still be a tremendous amount of discomfort that I'm
Yeah.
carrying with me,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I
And you
get
know, we
that.
do a lot of things to try to anesthetize that discomfort.
Yep. So true. Yeah, all of these things have such, limitations, like everything. But I think the problem is that we hear people using them like they're just a panacea. It's like this is the thing that is going to fix it. I'm just going to go on another retreat for whatever and take whatever the plant medicine is and unfortunately, you might get some temporary insight or benefit or something from it. But the long lasting stuff, you really have to just be aware because our sober life is just as psychedelic as one of those
Mhm.
trips when you really pay attention to it.
Yes, it is. I agree.
Um, yeah, it's I get the use, but I do tend to caution because I think we can really see so much when we are just absolutely quiet and present with our actual experience. And that in itself is so life-changing.
I agree.
So,
And you know, that's the thing is, like I said, you know, I have that in my history, but there were still things that were were still a part of me, that were still ingrained and still influencing how I lived my life.
yeah,
And you know, in the last however long it's been, you know, I'm getting reports from other people, and Susanna's a good one because she'll be really direct and really blunt with me. You know, I've had years of what I refer to as ego puncturing, where she'll
it's
let me
great.
know about some behavior of mine, like, okay, and I'm back at it.
Yep.
I'm really trying
Yep.
to work towards changing that behavior. But here, since you and I've been working together, I'm getting reports about decreased reactivity, being
Love
more
it.
open, being more receptive, being more demonstrative when it comes to love and affection, which was something that had bothered
Wonderful.
me for years. You know,
Yeah.
I didn't care for that Spock-like tendency. You know, so these things are changing, and I know she's telling me the truth because if those things hadn't changed, I wouldn't be hearing that. I would be hearing, you know, about how there's something I'm doing that needs to be different,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And so
That's
I'm
wonderful.
now, you know, it's kind of it's a fairly new thing. It's not entirely new, but I hear it more frequently than I ever did before, and about things that are more, to me, meaningful and substantial, uh,
Yeah.
in terms of the person that everyone's interacting with.
Wonderful. That's really, really
Uh,
good. Yeah, I'm really happy about that.
I am too.
Yeah, I
I can't
bet.
tell you how much so,
I
you know.
bet. That's amazing.
So, and that's
Um,
also it's also a part of, it's not the only thing, but it's part of what continues the drive to you know, follow this through, see it through wherever it may
yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's such a fascinating question mark of a path. We don't know how any of it's going to look, a year or 5 years down the road. It's like it just keeps changing and unfolding in very unpredictable ways. So
Hmm.
it's nice to, stay curious and just see how things go with as little expectation as possible, you know.
Yeah.
Right, you might plateau. It might seem like you're regressing in order to, see something new. We don't know. It's important to not judge any particular point of that supposed journey, because that's no point is the end goal, and no point is representative of the entire arc of the thing, you know? So we do have the tendency, though, as humans, to feel like everything should be a nice, straight, linear path all the way. If we have any sort of dips or turns, we must be backsliding or something must be wrong. I must be doing something wrong. So just remaining open to this is just how things are at this moment. It's only how everything ever is. But really having that acceptance that this is the way this moment is.
Well, I'm glad you said that because in the last week or two, the way things have been kind of playing out, there was this sense of things had kind of stalled. Now, I knew it wasn't always going to be this way, but I didn't, there was this um, non-acceptance and kind of, I wouldn't quite call it dislike, but this dissatisfaction with the fact that that's how it seemed, that
Mhm.
things had stalled out. And of course, the first thing is, well, we need to do something about this, which
Mhm.
is not necessarily true.
No,
So that's a
no.
that's a good
Yeah.
reminder.
Yeah, good. Yeah. It's such a fine line because, in some ways, we can become kind of apathetic and just, you know, uh, just sit in front of TV and wait for something to happen. But I don't think that's, the case for you. So I think in general, it's really finding that balance of not not expecting things to happen at a certain rate, but also still being engaged and, introspective and doing inquiry and all of that. Just being aware that we don't know. You might have like, it might feel like a plateau, and then all of a sudden there's just some, bang of a shift that happens that you don't expect. Or it might just be something that is so gradually subtle, so subtle and so gradual, you don't even notice that things are shifting and changing and happening until you look back 5 years later and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot I used to be like that. Um, it was funny because there was a little short film that popped up on YouTube the other day that I clicked on, and it was something where it was okay, but the main character it was like about like kind of life in her head, and she's like concerned about you know she's sitting with her friends, and it's like, oh, am I talking too much? Do they think I'm a narcissist? Do they, am I being too? And realized in that I'm like, I forgot what it was like to have those kind of self-obsessed thoughts where you're like so you know, really like, oh my God, they're looking at me. Oh, I shouldn't scratch my, like all of that kind of like self-reflective thinking. I
Yeah.
forgot how bad that used to be. And it was like, yeah, that's not there anymore. Like completely forgot about that. So it's helpful sometimes to see other perspectives of like, oh, right, yeah, like didn't notice that was changing, didn't recognize, at what one, there wasn't like one marked point where I wasn't having these really, self-obsessed. Sorry, do you need to go?
Yeah, hang on
Yeah,
just a
yeah,
sec, okay? I'm
yeah,
just gonna
yeah.
help Susanna in real quick. I'll be right back.
Hmm.
Well, what you were describing um, is kind of a good thing to keep in mind. I mean, because I do look back, but I don't think I ever look back in terms of specific things I can recall, like the self-reflective,
Hmm.
self-absorbed thoughts.
Yeah,
Not that I didn't have any of that sort of thing. I did, and I still do to a much lesser degree than I once did. But that's a that's a good way to be able to put things in perspective.
yeah. That's the thing. We forget, we're not really good judges of our experience as far as how it used to be compared to how it is. And it's very easy to forget that things have ever been different. So having those little markers where it's like, you suddenly realize, oh yeah, I do recognize that. I don't remember, no idea when that stopped. But I do remember being like that at some point and recognize that that is not currently the case. So interesting. Um, and that's our kind of how we are with everything. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
you're right. Huh.
most of us
Okay.
don't have really big, clear shifts for a lot of things where we just recognize like, oh, and from that moment on, I've never looked at chocolate again. It's like it's not just this like really clear cutoff, and we just kind of like adapt so kind of gradually that we just realize, yeah, of course, I'm kind of a different person now than I was. Yeah, well, there's some real insight to be found there. Isn't that interesting? Um, so
Well,
yeah.
the thing that had been uh, creating that sense of stalling was the fact that there are four things that I try to work into um, remembering to do as I go about my daily business. Um, one of them being the looking for the decision,
Hmm.
looking for, what's happening in that moment of deciding. Is there
Yeah.
someone who's making a decision? How's that happening? Um, and so there are four of them. And recently, I mean, I guess it was just 2 or 3 days ago, I realized I've been forgetting these things.
Hmm.
I mean, and then I thought about, well, I haven't forgotten them entirely. Some of the first one still happens from time to time. There's another one around selfing and looking for, who in that moment. Like I'm remembering that that's still happening some, but it had decreased, and there's a sense of disappointment. Because there's those are things that are valued pretty highly right
Hmm.
now.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know that my mind would ever go there from that point, from that sense of disappointment about um, forgetting to do those things, to wow, you're not as self-serving and self-absorbed as you used to be. Because truth is, the further we go back in the last 21 years or beyond, man,
Hmm.
I was egregiously so at times,
Yeah.
and 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 I even, completely unrelated to that, I do think sometimes about the fact that I'm really glad for the fact that I'm able, and that's the operative word, able to be so present and available for Susanna at
Yeah.
this point in her life when she needs me for almost everything.
Yeah.
Um, because there was a point in time that I don't think I seriously doubt that I would have been able to really be here for her the way she needs to be. But going from forgetting these little practices in a day to see how things have changed, there's a really big gap there.
Yeah.
I mean, they get thought of separately, but anything to connect the two? No, not until
Completely.
this conversation.
Completely. That's amazing. Yeah. It's also important to, again, this is where it's like individual basis and kind of, we have to be um we have to be accountable for our practice. And so this is where like, we have to have honesty with ourselves. And it is important to have time where we do step back and have some time to integrate things that we've seen and to not just keep pushing forward, 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 because that pushing forward, forward, forward is ironically also reinforcing the ego, right? Like, I want to get something out of this. I got to do, 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 do. That's a reinforcement. So we do sometimes need to just relax and step back and rest and let the body and mind do what it needs to do to integrate the things that have seen and to um, come to kind of a new, rewire itself, basically, come to a new way of being. But we also don't want to use that as an excuse to just, like I said, lie around watching TV all day and just, expect that everything's going to happen magically. Because it's probably not. So it's finding that balance for you, and everybody has to kind of find their own, where we have our own honest accountability for our experience. And in that, we need to learn for us what it feels like when we are really in need of just taking a rest and taking a step back for a little while and going about living life however it is and allowing that to be at the forefront. And when I'm just using that as an excuse because I really don't feel like investigating or inquiring or sitting on a meditation cushion, and I'm just, now I have a convenient out. So, but that's for each person to kind of have their own honesty with their practice and the own insight into your own needs, so that it's not that what we don't want is to be constantly having that third fetter doing something for a purpose all the time, where you know, I
Hmm.
need to do this because I need to become a better person. I need to become enlightened. I need to become whatever. So I have to keep doing this, put everything else for behind, putting everything else second. This comes first. Go, 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 go. That um has a lot of limitations because that is reinforcing the self. That is reinforcing the one who's going to get something out of this practice.
Yeah.
But it's
Uh,
also important to not just, loaf around and give up on it if we really have aspirations for this, because then we're fall into the same trap where now lying on a couch, vegging out just seems cozy. And, it can be just as much ego identification. And, instead of looking into why I really don't feel like sitting on a meditation cushion today, now I'm just doing the cozy, easy thing and not sitting on a meditation cushion. You know, there's probably some fourth, fifth fetter stuff involved with that that is keeping you from sitting on a meditation cushion. So it's a combination of, like intelligent practice where you're really aware of what's going on and not taking anything at face value, but also not bulldozing right through all of your bodily needs and kind of the inner wisdom, that intuition that's there that's saying, no, no, you really have been doing a lot. You really, if you just really feel like you cannot sit on that meditation cushion, don't sit on that meditation cushion. If it really feels like there are other things that are a higher priority, that feel authentically of a higher priority, then let them be the higher priority right now. And then come back to it when that light of inspiration pulls you to it. Um, if a resistance to that comes up, well, look at what is it that I think I'm actually getting out of the awakening path in general. Go down that road. You know, what is this
hmm.
supposed to be giving me? Why am I so driven to walk this path and to get something at the end of the road? Am I driven to get something at the end of the road? Why is it that I don't feel like doing inquiry? Because I don't feel like I get anything out of it. I feel like I'm not smart enough to get something out of it. I feel like I'm bored when I try to do it. I feel like it just takes too much energy, and I don't have that much mental energy right now because I've got a lot of other stuff going on. Whatever the mind churns up as an excuse, go deeper with that. Look into it. Is it real? Is it pointing to something else that needs your attention? It's just it's that real back and forth investigation where you're just constantly taking nothing at face value. You take nothing for granted. You're just always going that one step below everything else to see, okay, why am I doing what I'm doing? Is that actually the real reason? Is that really a good, true, the first thing that pops up? How do I know that that's true? What could be behind that? And then keep feeling lower and lower and lower to really break apart all the little facets of the experience until eventually we're left at the doing is happening or the doing is not happening. There's no There's no controller, there's no agency, there's nothing in there, but we need to kind of work our way down to that base level to see that the path is either unfolding or it's not unfolding. That
Hmm.
sitting here with discomfort is happening or not happening.
Well, I don't. I actually like inquiry. My only frustration with inquiry is that what I've seemed to have discovered is that it is a an acquired skill. It's
Mm-hmm.
something that at least for me anyway, it's not possible to just right off the bat be able to continue to ask good or even the right questions. It's getting better, but
Mm-hmm.
it really, for me, more often than not, it's start to ask questions, and after maybe two, three, maybe four questions, I hit a wall. I'm like, I don't know where to go with this now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the desire to do it is there, and it's something that, for lack of a better way of putting it, I like it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the way my mind is wired, naturally kind of that way anyway.
Yeah.
Um, but um, and this is something that comes up from time to time. I wonder about it, and I don't really push it. Is that after what something near 20 years of meditating, my meditation practice just truly in a day it just disappeared, and I've made attempts to get it back, and for some reason it just doesn't happen. So I've allowed that to go. And the thing that I would not have expected is that by trying to do inquiry and look into what's going on to the best of my ability, because sometimes it's can be, frequently it falters to some degree or another. But by doing that as I'm going about the business of living each day, it seems like I've gotten more out of that, and there have been more results
Mm-hmm.
than there were for all of the years
Yeah.
of sitting on a cushion.
Yeah. That's why I'm such a big proponent of it. I've done lots of years of different types of meditation, but it's really that inquiry, that in daily environment that has been the most transformative for me too. So
Okay.
that's why you know, I love meditation. No, no question about that. I think it's super useful in a lot of ways. And I know inquiry isn't for everybody. Not everybody, it just doesn't, for whatever reason, it just doesn't resonate for a lot of people. And that's
Hmm.
fine. We have lots of other options also. But for those who it does, I do find that to be a really potent way of getting to the root of everything. Um, and I don't have like a formula for inquiring. Like like you said, sometimes you just kind of hit a wall with the questions. You don't know where to go from there. Um, I think a thing to kind of keep in mind, maybe, I haven't really said this before, but I guess as a guidepost, maybe, is always take the opposite stance of wherever you are right now. So much of what we do is effectively negation. It's kind of like the neti neti practice, but not quite
Oh, yeah.
fully, right? So it feels like it's a self. Okay. So what feels like a self? We're investigating into that because we're kind of coming from the premise that there is no self. So we're basically
Mhm.
taking the opposite. If you had told me that there is no self, I'm also going to inquire into, well, how do you know that there's no self? What evidence do you have right now that even tells that there's no self there? How would you define the self? So we're always kind of coming from wherever the base is and then looking into why do I believe this to be the case? And we're basically turning it around to kind of investigate the opposite of it. Craving is absolutely real, totally exists. When I want a donut, damn it, I have to have a donut. Okay, is that true? Let's investigate. What does it feel like? And then we break down the experience to find out whether we can actually find that thing. And so we're always trying to um, question the baseline of our reality. Anything that shows up, we question it. We basically turn the microscope on it. from the viewpoint that this might not actually be the way that I think it is. If it's not, then how is it? And that's really our motivation is to just see what is here underneath my assumption of what I think it is. And if I don't have an assumption of what it is, then what is it? What is it if I can't label it?
Hmm.
Now what's here? And we can do that with absolutely every part of our experience. Like I said with the plant, I can't tell that that is an actual plant. The mind assumes that it is, but the mind can also come up with an endless number of other possibilities of what it might be. That is not a plant. And like we talked about, I can't even tell, how do I know that I'm not hallucinating right now? That I'm not in a coma? That I'm not dead and this is some afterlife, like they say the brain lives on for, so many seconds or after the body has technically died, that you might have this window of sort of salvia like, living a whole life after the you've technically just died. So, I could have been in a guillotine, and then like the head is still rolling and it's having this whole previous life going on before the lights go out, who knows, right? I can't tell that by this experience. It's constantly coming into, well, what would that be like? How would that feel? How do I believe that there is any reality to this existence? In my direct experience, what proof do I have that my interpretation of anything has any sort of veracity to it? How do I know that there is any grain of truth to my perception of any part of this experience?
Well, I mean, this is not going to be sufficient unto itself. Obviously, the questions have to be asked, but the thing is I understand that there isn't.
No. But
Eh,
we really like exactly we have to just investigate that to really get that feeling of the rug just being pulled right out from under us.
right.
There is no place to land.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's where we can have like I love that we're in a period now where when we listen to physicists and neuroscientists and AI people and all this stuff, they're basically all saying that, the self doesn't really exist, the mind is creating its hallucination. We're in that point, but they don't have the kind of same uh, changes in experience that because it's intellectual. They understand that, the brain is creating the sense of self by this mechanism and that mechanism, and these networks are speaking together and blah, blah, blah. And we can't find a self anywhere, therefore there's no self. But that same insight only has potency when we have this direct experience of from the inside recognizing that there is no place to stand. And that is different than just an intellectual understanding where, yeah, okay, but I still feel like a self. And so I'm still just going to go about my life interacting with everybody as though I have agency, even though I can give, a dissertation on how we don't actually have agency and free will doesn't exist. I'm still going to live my life. Like, perfect example. I love Dr. Robert Sapolsky. He is
And
wonderful. And I mean, he is like, major proponent in there being no free will. He goes into, they bring him into trials to, try to get people off of the death penalty because he can, um, elucidate all the reasons why this person did not have free will to act the way that they did. He's taught courses on it. He's written books on it. Absolutely brilliant. But I've heard him say in interviews that basically it still feels like he has free will. So, he knows that he doesn't, but he still feels like he does. So it doesn't really affect his daily behavior or his, internal composition about anything because it still feels like it's the case. He hasn't done the kind of practices that take it from the intellectual into the embodied.
yeah, that's where I was about to head with it. Uh, is that they get it intellectually, They have a solid intellectual understanding of it, but they've never had that aha moment where you feel it
Hmm.
in your body.
Exactly. Exactly. And so there's a difference between intellectually knowing that the brain is projecting, reality based on its own conditioning, and we can't really tell that we're not hallucinating. And I get that, and it's kind of a fun thing to think about, but it doesn't have that gravity to the insight when we don't really fully investigate it to the point that it feels like we're just dropped off of a roller coaster or something. That you really feel that gut lurch where everything suddenly becomes, almost transparent. It's like you really recognize in a very visceral way that this is just a visual thought. This is just an auditory thought. This is just a sensation thought. None of it has anything substantial behind it other than it is just a thought. Not even the things that I just think of that are not in this room are thoughts, but the room itself is a thought. Everything as it is being experienced is an interpretation that is a thought. And all of that is incredibly thin, transparent, insubstantial, and not really connected. The visual field isn't really connected in the way to the felt sense as we imagine it to be. It's not really connected to the auditory sense the way that we imagine it to be. And we can really break all of this apart. And through that direct experience of breaking all of this stuff apart, then we really lose that sense of identity, that sense of, me being able to be injured by somebody else's words. All of that falls away with it because of course it is my hallucination. I can't say that the person yelling at me across the room is even real necessarily. We can really take it to an extreme. um I'm not saying we should get lost there either. We do have to come back to find that kind of middle way where both are true, but we can really be deeply informed by that experience of also, this is also not real. This is also my projection. This is also a hallucination. This is also just a thought. Could still have compassion for other people who are experiencing things, but recognize that my perception of them is still a thought. We
Well,
can,
and that having compassion seems at least necessary, if not possibly even real stretch, but I'll say in a way kind of required because we're dealing, odds are we're dealing with somebody who hasn't hasn't heard or understood anything of this or anything like it. And
right.
so the world is absolutely, utterly, and entirely real
Yeah,
for them from top to bottom. And so,
completely.
if they're suffering, they're really suffering.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And even when we are seeing, you know, awful atrocities across the globe, we can recognize that um, we need to still have compassion for everything that's going on. And then also recognize how, if it feels like it's got some sort of personalized element to it, some identification with that, just recognize how that aspect of it is also coming from our projection. I'm not saying that we're creating the entire, war or whatever it is out of our own mind, but recognize that
Right.
our perception of it is created by this thought world that we're in. And it's relevant to me because it is my projection. Of course it's relevant to me. Of course I feel a certain way towards it. And it goes back to what you were saying before about, when you hear Susanna's watching the news and you catch some of that and it makes you feel, selfing. Of course, you're picking up on the aspects of it which are relevant to you and your conditioning. And those seem potent because they are personal.
Well, and what you're saying it kind of lines up with the what just occurred to me, which is that um, hearing that stuff and having a reaction is an indicator that that should be looked into, because hearing that and having a reaction is no different than um, hearing the dogs licking and
Yeah,
that, oh, stop that.
spot on.
You know,
Exactly.
that reaction, that
Yep.
discomfort inside is, I'm overlooking that a lot of the time.
Exactly
No,
right.
no, no, no. Remember, remember, remember that if you're having that reaction, if there's that feeling inside, that's telling you to take a look.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, like I would say, like I said with the inquiry of being sort of, we're kind of like always looking at the opposite side of things, or the negative. We could say we're kind of always asking why, but it's not, it's like a rhetorical why. We're not asking why because we want to get a distinct answer for it necessarily. It's a why because, like, well, why do I have to feel irritated when a dog is licking? Why does that sound? And I don't have to go back and create a story about, well, it's because blah, 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 and it was, blah, blah, and now every time I hear it, there's some relation to that. Maybe true, maybe not. The question is, what is that doing in my body right now? What do I actually feel when I hear that? And can I hear that as a completely benign sound, unrelated to absolutely anything else? Can I just hear the sound? Sound, again, doesn't have the ability to create that kind of, there's nothing injurious to you about the sound of like a wet tongue, right? Like
Right.
there's some association that has to be added to that to make it into something more, because not everybody has the same association. Certainly the
Right.
dogs don't have it, and not every human has it. So
Right.
what is it specifically about that sound which feels a certain way in the body? And can I detach it from that feeling? Can I just hear it as just sound? It's just musical notes that have a certain, quality to them, right? It's like a
Huh.
different kind of instrument. We're putting all of the association on it that it has. So can we take that off and just be with the direct experience of the sound on its own, and also the direct experience of however the body is reacting right now? That tensing up, that feeling of, whatever it is, you just feel that. Hold on a second. Is that in itself a response to that sound? Is it like me bracing for that sound to not hurt me in some way, to not feel something? Well, if I relax, if I take a breath, and then feel what's happening in the body when I hear that sound, that's not just the bracing protective reaction. What are you actually feeling? What does it make you feel?
Well, if I answer the question, what does it make me feel? Isn't that circling back to where we started? In other words, there's a feeling, but the feeling is just a conditioned response.
It is, but so we're looking at two different things. One is
Okay.
to take the actual stimulus itself, the
Mhm.
sound of the licking, and recognize that there's nothing inherently problematic in that sound. That sound is just any other sound. It is just waves of vibration moving through the air. And depending on the context, we could contextualize it into any number of different things. For some people, they love ASMR videos where you hear sounds of licking. They
Yeah.
intentionally put on headphones and listen to it for hours. So there's nothing inherently positive or negative about the sound itself. So
Right.
can we
Okay.
hear that it is just absolutely innocuous sensory information? That's one side of it. The other side is to then go, okay, but clearly every time I hear this completely innocuous sensory information, I feel something in the body. Now, we usually think that the first thing is, well, I feel, rage and want to lash out at whoever it is that's making the sound and stop it immediately. but that's the reaction already. It's not really causing that feeling of rage or disgust or well, the disgust maybe, but the rage, the bracing, right? It's something
Right.
beneath that feels uncomfortable. So then we go down underneath, if you can relax that rage for a moment and feel, just listen to the sound. And what does it bring up? Does it feel particularly vulnerable? Does it feel intimate? Is there some like sexual connotation for you that it brings up? Is there something where there's like a mouth feeling that brings up? What is it that it brings up in the body that has a connotation that feels uncomfortable in this context? And then see if you can be with that.
Okay. So, and I know this is going to seem, can't even think to put the words together. Um, this might be seen as something that should be obvious at this point, but that last thing you said about to just be with it, you're talking
Yeah.
about just giving it space to be and just being present with it.
Yeah, with whatever that initial thing is, whatever the initial association is that it brings up in the body that might feel just vulnerable, embarrassed, awkward in some way. It might be something that you're not expecting that's underneath
Ah,
there that just feels. And so instead of being with that, you've built up the habit of just pushing it away and getting angry about it and saying stop
right.
and all that. So we want to feel that undercurrent that it's bringing with it. So again, on one hand, we kind of decondition ourselves by recognizing that it's just a sound and it doesn't mean anything. But we also can get the benefit out of noticing, yeah, but I'm also, anytime that I feel this sense of embarrassment or vulnerability or intimacy, whatever it is, that actually makes me feel really uncomfortable. And so I tend to react with anger or stiffening up to block from that. So that's another wonderful place of insight.
So what you're saying is when these uncomfortable sensations in the body show up, there's a reason why. There's something that's underneath that, and we need to
Yeah,
figure out what that is.
exactly.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
there's likely some sort of association with that sound that makes us cringe and hate it and run away. Um, and we may or may not need to know, the history of it, of why we built up that association. The really important thing to note is, what does that association, how does it show up in the body? And can I accept it? Can I
Yep.
accept that it's there and just be with it?
Keep
And
going.
then, sure, sure, sure.
I'm waiting for you. You show up. Okay.
So can I be with it? And then by also recognizing that completely benign nature of whatever the stimulus is, we're also less making it less likely that we are going to be triggered by that in the future. But even if we do get triggered by that in the future, we realize that we can still sit with that discomfort that we feel, that sort of that mild feeling of vulnerability or intimacy or whatever it is. And we might get, by being able to be with that, we might get some deeper insight into um, the fact that, I don't feel comfortable being open and vulnerable about something. I mean, it could be even something related to, like you've said that in the past you've had a hard time being like being externally, demonstrative with being loving and all of
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
There's an intimacy in that which might feel vulnerable and uncomfortable. And there might be even a connection between those things that you have yet to discover. And if we find what it is to feel uncomfortable, what it is about being intimate that feels uncomfortably vulnerable, and we recognize that it's okay to feel that sense of vulnerability, we can be with that sense of Yes, I'm open to being hurt. Yes, if I'm being vulnerable, there is a possibility of being hurt by somebody. If I'm honest about my feelings, yes, it does open me up for those things, but I'm okay with that. I'm able to accept the discomfort that arises that's trying to keep me protected. You can feel that. You can be with that. You can be with all of that, and then realize that that's the same thing that might be carrying over into other scenarios that you're just not even aware of. So as we get down to these more core issues, you might find that other seemingly unrelated reactive triggers just also sort of cease to be reactive.
Hmm. Real quick, going back to something you said a minute
Yeah.
ago, you were talking about deconditioning the reaction to unpleasant sounds or whatever it might be, so that, and this isn't how you said it. I can't remember exactly how you said it. So that we don't, we're not set off by that stimulus, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And there were two parts, and that was the first part. But I heard you, and it made sense. But now, for some reason, it does. I'm not clear on what we're doing to work with the stimulus so that it's not um, so so it doesn't tend to provoke us as much.
The part where we just want to um, be with it as sort of cleanly as we can. That we just notice the raw sensory information of it. Like, if you were to look at, I see your guitar in the background. So, like, if we were to look at a guitar, you might have the initial thoughts about that particular guitar or that
Mm.
particular style of guitar and whether I like it or not, whether I'm a Fender guy or a Gibson guy, whether I like the Tele or whether I prefer a Strat or whatever the thing is, you might have all those thoughts. You might have thoughts about the color and the style and the year and all of those things might factor in. But you can also come down to just the raw visual blobs of color of there's like yellowish, blackish, yellowish, however it shows up for you. And it's just completely disconnected from any thoughts about what the object might be. It's just an abstract painting, basically. We can
Mhm.
really just bring it down to it's just a of color. And it's the same kind of thing that we can do with sounds as well, where we just really hear it not as this is musical or this is noise, this is pleasant or this is unpleasant, this is dissonant, this is consonant. We don't have to take any of that in. We can really just come to the absolute raw sensation of that sound. And by doing that, we take away all of those judgments and assumptions about it. All of those thoughts of whether I like that sound, it's an unpleasant sound, I know where that sound is coming from. If you close your eyes, you don't really know where the sound is coming from. The more attention you put on it, right, it could be any number of different things that all sort of become interchangeable. Like I remember in Disney World years ago in Epcot, there was a thing where you would sit in it and they were like trying to show you that your senses can be fooled. And so I think they had headphones back in those days, and you put on the headphones and you would hear a sound and it would be like, does this sound like a rainstorm? And it's like, yes, it does. Actually, it's frying bacon. And so it's that kind of thing where like it really you recognize that, oh, I had the idea that this was the case. And this the sound means that. But actually, it's completely wrong. It's something entirely different than we thought it was. It's very easy to fool us with visual and auditory illusions. Um, so we're going underneath our thoughts and our knowledge about what we think it is, and just be with the actual sensation of the sound, so that we recognize that the actual sensation of sound, the actual how kind of intangible, very difficult to define thing that sound is in our perception, that in itself has no valence to it. There's no good or bad to that sound. There's no liking it or not liking it. It's just raw sound data. And
That's the easiest way for me to
yeah,
keep that in mind is to just think about, as you put it once, the inherent neutrality of all things.
exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
all right.
It's really finding that it is absolutely neutral and absolutely empty of any meaning or context or inherent reality of itself. We have to add all of that on top of it. Um, how can you react to something if it's just completely neutral? Yeah,
Yeah,
there's no it's just a fact of sound. Like it is just the way that it is, and there is no anything to be said about it. So that's all. That's all. And so that seeing or hearing things like that really defuses that reactive capacity of it because it can't touch anything. It's just, you know, it, absolutely just empty.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I can see that, and then that I can work with it from that idea. That's very very doable for me. It's funny that this has come up because um, it, I don't know if I didn't notice it. I don't know what the deal was, but it seems like it had kind of disappeared. And then yesterday or the day before, um, uh, while we were in bed, one of the dogs was just going to town, and there was that reaction. Like, gosh, I haven't seen this in a while.
Yeah,
And there was the
interesting.
reaction, like, okay, you got to work with this. You got to work with this. And I just couldn't seem to get past the reaction. It was just,
Yeah.
I mean, Digby, the dog in question, it was just over there, and it sounded like somebody was a group of people were fighting a war with wet sponges. It was just noisy as heck. And I mean, like I said, I was just stuck with the reaction. Like, okay, well, just then stay with the reaction. Then if you can't do any more than that right now, then this will just have to do. So
Uh,
I held in with it as long as I could.
nice. It is so interesting too, because do you notice that like so you're lying in bed, you can't actually see him. Are you seeing images of him in your mind?
Oh, I don't recall. I think I was so possessed by the sound and the sensation of the body. I don't know if that was going on.
It's
I might
uh,
have been, but I don't think so. I think it was just the sound and the reaction, the sensation reaction were fairly all consuming.
so it's such a great opportunity to make that sound into the object of a sound meditation. You just focus. This is what I've been talking about, but it's just focusing so intently on the sound. Go into the thing that seems to be the cause of your aversion,
I
and then
see.
you just go right into that sound. Really absorb into it. What is it really like underneath all those thoughts about its provenance and you know all the judgments about it and any of that? Just meditate directly on the sound.
Okay. All right, I can do that.
Let's
I'm
do
going to get ample opportunity to as well because for some reason I don't know what's changed with that dog, but good golly, it's become a regular thing. So,
Perfect. He's doing it just to give you practice time. So that's wonderful. You should be really grateful.
yeah, well, and that is how I tend to see those things. I used to have this sponsor years back who I would come to him with various things that were going on that were upsetting or what have you. And so often he would just say, and he had this voice, and I can't quite imitate it, but I got in the habit of trying to approximate it years ago. But anyway, so I would lay on him whatever it was that I had. And he was like, well, that's another wonderful opportunity for spiritual growth. And
There
so
you go.
I've been pulling that one out with Susanna lately. Yeah,
That's amazing.
something will come up and I'll tell her, that this is, really, bugging me or giving me issue. And I'll go on it for about it for a minute, and then I'll end it with that idea because I recognize that I mean, what other choice do you really have? I mean,
That's it.
yeah,
You either react to something or you use it as an opportunity to investigate.
yeah. And if you don't take that opportunity, then you're kind of condemning yourself to a lifetime of reactivity. So, and I'm not really
Exactly.
that idea.
That's the karma people talk about all the time.
Wow, I had
Yeah.
never thought of it in that way. I mean, I don't think about it the way people do, where it's some sort of,
No,
impersonal justice,
no.
impersonal justice machine that, is built into the universe. I've never thought of it that way. I mean, I've
Yeah.
read too much of the Pali Canon to have that
Yeah.
crazy idea, but that is, wow, that is
That
a great way to frame it.
that is the habitual motion of karma. We just keep doing the same thing, and it causes more and more of the same behavior.
Wow, man.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that. I really am. That I needed to hear that. That is something else. I never thought of it like that. Wow. Huh. Okay. Well, that's I can feel that one's going to be um, percolating down for a while
Amazing.
now.
That's wonderful.
um, well, all of this is seems pretty squarely centered in Fetters 4 and 5.
Yeah.
It kind of hit me in the last week or two that you know for a long time, for months, I've really been seeing this just in terms of food and drink and consuming things that I didn't want to consume or that weren't good for me or it was happening so frequently that there were problems in that and I completely got lost in that and then it hit me that that's just one small portion of the bigger picture that it's really about the kind of things we've been talking about now with the reactions to sounds
Yep.
or what people are saying and what those words represent or a big one that has come up lately is people who we feel uncomfortable with or that um, uh, activate a sense of being threatened
Yeah.
and because we had a situation with a person that we know recently, and there
Okay.
was a really strong reaction, and that's what it was. It was a sense of really being frightened by that person's presence, and
Yeah.
that's Federer 4 and 5. To myself, you're you've been overlooking all of this other stuff. There's all this other stuff that's every bit as important, possibly even in some ways more important, and it's completely getting overlooked.
Yeah.
There's this
Yeah.
whole range of things that is desire and aversion. And it's just,
Yep.
you know, eh, having said that, I'm still finding myself having difficulty with when going for something, and it's not necessarily food or drink. It could be, something to change how I feel. Um, and that I'll tell myself, okay, this is going to come up again. When it does, you got to remember to pause when that thought comes up because it's just a
Mm.
thought. It's nothing more than a thought. It's just a
Yep.
sound in the mind.
Yep.
And then it'll happen and I completely forget. And then after the
Yep.
fact, I'm like, okay, we're hoping to do something different with this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, next time. And,
Yep.
but something came to mind that you said to me back, I think, when we first started talking, is that sometimes forgetting can be a form of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I've kind of been wondering, and I don't know if there's really any way to tell, you know?
No, no, it's more of like because it is kind of happening under the hood, so to speak.
Right.
It's not obviously remembering is not a conscious act, and forgetting is not a conscious act.
Right.
Right. So, for whatever reason, part of the system might be set up that one of your defenses is to conveniently forget to look into these things. And there's, again, there's no agency in forgetting. So it's really more of a matter of planting enough seeds, that to wanting to do this, that the likelihood of that
Okay.
overwhelming the habitual response to forget becomes more likely. So the more that you are able to remember, the more likely, again, kusala karma, right? The good karma is the doing the practice that leads you to doing more practice. The akusala karma, the thing where, you're just doing the other diversive behavior over and over again. Not
Right.
morally bad, but just leading you further and further away from insight. So the more you do the diversion, the more you're likely to do the diversion. The more you do the inquiry, the more you're likely to do the inquiry. And it's just that habitual um, behavior. So when you can remember, reinforcing that in some way can help. Like, ooh, yeah, go me. I remembered. Having those like little like pat on the back. Um, then we're reinforcing the likelihood that you're going to see it again, and in the real time, remember to actually investigate it.
Okay.
Otherwise, for whatever reason, the proposed benefit that you're getting out of the distracting or aversive behavior is stronger than what it feels like you would get by doing the inquiry and investigating.
S- Say that again.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
lost me there somewhere.
it's okay. In the moment, if you still find that you forget to look, it's because there's something internally that feels like the benefit of using the diversion of
Mm,
actually performing
okay.
the action, you're getting more out of that than you would by doing the investigation into it. So the habit still stands that I'm still going to do whatever the thing is to change my behavior or to change my mood right now or whatever. And that for whatever reason had more of a pull to it. So there we go. That's what happened. But every time you remember afterwards is still helping to kind of set the stage that the next time it happens, you're a little bit more
Yes.
likely to remember. So every time you remember to do it, whether it's before or after, is still beneficial.
Yes, I agree. I
So
agree.
keep
Okay.
setting the stage. Eventually it happens. And then the more it happens, the more it happens.
Yeah, because if I can, with certain things like caffeine is one of the really big ones. If I can remember to pause and go with the sensation in the body that is um, giving, seemingly giving substance to the thought that
Mm,
starts the whole thing, that even if I'm not successful the first 50 times, just being able to get to that point of pause, stop, and investigate the feeling,
yeah.
sooner or later, that line will get crossed. But I've got to get to the point where there's that pause and can really get into the bodily sensation and see what's going on there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
okay. Huh. Um, Kind of apropos of nothing necessarily other than just it's related to this. Um, had an amusing and very telling incident with regard to agency and
Mm,
volition. Um, I have got a very long list of things that need to be done around the house. And some of them are a much higher priority than others for whatever reason. And, um, I've been trying to get to them, and one thing or another, gets in the way. And the next thing I know, I find myself out in the sunroom with a small vacuum cleaner cleaning up out there because there was a bunch of, things that had accumulated, dead bugs, dust, what have you. And So I'm cleaning all this up, and as I'm going about doing it, I realized, okay, so not only is this a really low priority, if I was going to choose something, I would have chosen something that really needs to be done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then there was a recognition of the fact that I just kind of woke up in the moment doing this task and
Yeah.
realized there wasn't even a moment of decision. I mean, at least not in any way that was really noticeable. It was very subtle and it was very quick. Just
Yeah.
I just suddenly find myself here cleaning this stuff up.
Yeah.
And I just had to pause for a minute because it really was a very telling way of seeing, that there wasn't a decision made. No one was making a decision because God knows if there was a conscious, intentional decision, I
Yeah.
would have taken care of the stuff that's leading to a leak in the sunroom that,
Yeah.
if I don't take care of it eventually, we're going to be replacing the roof in the sunroom, which we don't have the money to do. So
Right.
that
Right.
would have been top of the list. But
Yep.
no, that's not what
Completely.
happened.
No,
So it was very telling.
that's wonderful. It's so interesting.
It is. I mean, I know that may sound silly to some people, but that really stopped me in my tracks. I really
Yeah.
had to think about that for a minute when all of a sudden I kind of woke up in that moment.
I love that. Yeah. That's awesome.
So
Amazing.
we're
I'm
heading in the
happy.
right direction. So
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
yeah, well, thanks for asking.
Of course, sending my best, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Okay, I'll talk to you then.
Good luck. Yep. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.